I remember the exact moment the air shifted, the way an invisible weight settled on my skin as if the house itself were holding its breath, and it hit me with a quiet violence that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The scent of bleach slid into my lungs like a cold blade, sharp and clinical, slicing through the warmth that should have lived in a home filled with laughter and shared history. And although my sister greeted me with a smile stretched too wide and held too long, her eyes flickered with a tremor she couldn't bury, a tremor that told me her words were a fragile bridge stretched over a chasm she prayed I wouldn't look into. She said, "She's with friends," as though it were a shield thick enough to keep me from sensing the truth. Yet the hallway behind her carried an unnatural stillness, a silence that pressed against my temples, making my heartbeat stumble into an uneasy rhythm. Everything around me was too clean, too scrubbed, too curated, like a set designed to imitate normalcy but built by someone who had never experienced it. The living room lights burned too bright, casting ghost-pale reflections across the polished floors, and even the air tasted sanitized, stripped bare of the chaotic, messy humanness of someone who had been living and breathing inside these walls only hours ago. I stepped inside because she gestured for me to enter, but my instincts, old and stubborn and shaped by years of learning to read danger in the smallest gestures, whispered that I should run instead, that coming here was a mistake, that whatever story she had prepared for me was not designed to withstand touch. Still, I moved forward, my gaze dragging across the spotless kitchen counters where droplets of water clung like tiny confessions, the faintest smear on the edge of the sink betraying hurried hands and frantic decisions. My sister hovered behind me, close enough for me to feel her tension radiating like heat from asphalt, yet far enough that her presence seemed like a silhouette rather than a person, her voice suddenly too soft when she asked how my week had been, her attempt at small talk collapsing under the weight of the very thing she wanted to hide. I tried to answer, but the words dissolved before they reached my tongue, replaced by the heavy awareness that a truth was swelling beneath the surface of her lies, trying to claw its way into the open. And as I turned slowly toward her, the harsh light caught the raw redness around her knuckles, the faint tremor in her breath, and the twitch at the corner of her mouth as she tried to maintain the fragile mask of normalcy. And it was in that moment, suspended, brittle, trembling, that I realized the lie wasn't meant to fool me. It was meant to protect her from a reality she couldn't face alone. If you're watching this and you've ever felt that strange, gut-deep tug telling you something is off before you can explain why, tell me in the comments, because sometimes our instincts know long before we do. I walked deeper into the house with a quiet caution, the kind reserved for entering unfamiliar territory, even when the walls are familiar, because nothing felt aligned with the truth I'd been fed. The puzzle pieces were all wrong, jagged edges forced into places they didn't belong, and the result was a picture that didn't resemble anything real. My sister trailed behind me, trying too hard to mimic calm, but there was a storm trapped in the way she clasped her hands, a frantic rhythm pulsing in her jaw each time she swallowed hard enough to make her throat ripple. The bleach smell clung to everything, not a gentle cleaning fragrance but a suffocating chemical cloud, the kind used to erase something rather than cleanse it, and it coated the back of my tongue until my throat felt raw. The curtains in the den were drawn tightly shut, even though she always let the sun spill in through those windows. The lamp in the corner flickered with an anxious buzz, as if it were unsettled by what it had witnessed. On the coffee table were two mismatched mugs, one still damp with a ring of condensation, as though someone had placed it down in a hurry, and beside it, a hair tie stretched thin, a few strands still caught in its knot, unmistakably hers. My sister's claim that she's with friends rustled through my mind with a hollow echo. It didn't fit with the evidence scattered around me, the quiet chaos disguised beneath forced order. The back of my neck prickled as I noticed the trash bin tucked behind the kitchen island, a white plastic bag knotted too tightly, its sides bulging with something oddly heavy and angular inside. And though I didn't dare touch it, the sight burrowed into my thoughts, stirring a dread thick enough to slow my steps. My sister spoke again, her voice thin as paper, asking if I wanted a drink, but the tremor in her tone made it sound like a plea for time, for a delay, for me not to see whatever she feared would unravel her. I met her gaze, and the moment our eyes locked, her facade splintered just slightly, revealing the raw panic quivering beneath the surface. And in that sliver of vulnerability, I sensed something else too. Not guilt, not malice, but desperation, the kind that grows from being cornered by circumstances too heavy to carry alone. The house seemed to pulse around us, each heartbeat amplifying the tension until even the quiet hum of the refrigerator sounded accusatory. And as I exhaled slowly, I felt the narrative tightening, the conflict shaping itself with a force I couldn't yet name but could undeniably feel in my bones. When I finally turned back toward the hallway, drawn by a gravity I didn't want to acknowledge, the air shifted again, colder, denser, heavy with the echo of something unspoken, and my sister's breath hitched behind me, as though she feared the hallway itself might betray her. I took a step, then another, the wooden floor beneath me creaking with a hesitant groan, and each movement magnified the eerie stillness pressed against the walls like a trapped scream. At the end of the hall was her room, the door half open, a sliver of darkness seeping out from inside like spilled ink, and I felt an instinctive pull toward it, even as my pulse hammered with warning. My sister murmured my name in a voice that sounded like it had been scraped thin, and when I glanced back, her expression was fragmented. Fear, hope, dread, and a fragile plea tangled together in a single trembling breath. She didn't want me to go inside. She didn't want me to see. But the truth was already unraveling, thread by thread, and I could feel it winding around my ankles, tugging me forward. The closer I got, the stronger the bleach smell became, no longer just clinging to the air, but radiating from the very fibers of the carpet as though something had seeped deep into it. My fingertips brushed the edge of the door, and in that instant I knew nothing about tonight would leave me unchanged. Something had already happened here, something that would rewrite the lines between us, reshape the story of this family, and leave an imprint on the rest of my life. I wasn't afraid of the truth. I'd faced darkness before, but I was terrified of what it would do to my sister once spoken aloud. Still, I pushed the door open, my breath snagging in my chest as the shadows inside shifted, and even though I hadn't yet seen the full picture, I understood with a clarity that made my heart ache that this moment would define everything that came after. Before we go deeper, before I unravel the next layer of this story, tell me. The door opened into a silence that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something unspeakable, the kind of silence that hums beneath the skin, vibrating through the bones until even breathing feels like an intrusion. And I stood there suspended between the familiar and the unknown, between the lie my sister had spoken and the truth that lingered in the air like smoke that refused to clear. The room before me was eerily immaculate, stripped of life and color, the kind of sterile order that screams of chaos hidden just out of sight, and the smell of bleach wrapped around me like a shroud, clinging to my throat, searing my nostrils until every breath burned. Sunlight tried to seep in through the curtains, but the fabric was drawn too tightly, choking the day outside, leaving only a dull glow that made the room appear underwater, slow and distorted. The bed was perfectly made, the sheets tucked in with such precision that it felt almost ceremonial, but the perfection itself was unsettling, too deliberate, too forced, like someone trying to erase the memory of what had once been here. I took a hesitant step forward and the floor creaked beneath my weight, a small betrayal in a room that begged to stay still, and my pulse began to drum louder, syncing with the faint hum of the light overhead, a rhythm that filled the space like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I could feel my sister behind me, her presence trembling, her breath shallow, as though the very act of standing there cost her more than she could afford. I didn't turn to face her yet. I couldn't. My eyes were tracing the edges of the room, searching for what the bleach couldn't hide. A story written in small details, in smudges too stubborn to scrub away, in the echoes that lingered between walls once filled with laughter. There was a framed photograph on the nightstand turned face down, its back slick with cleaning solution, a damp line cutting across the surface as though tears had mixed with bleach there. I reached out, my fingertips hovering just above it, but I didn't flip it over. Some part of me wasn't ready to see her face, wasn't ready to confirm what my instincts already screamed. Instead, my gaze caught the faintest discoloration on the floor near the rug, a patch slightly darker than the rest, and in that small irregularity lay the entire story, the truth waiting in the quiet like an animal crouched in the dark. My sister's voice broke the stillness behind me, not with words but with sound, a fragile exhale that trembled on the edge of speech and dissolved before it could take shape, and I felt her fear ripple through the air like heat. I turned slowly, my movements deliberate, as though any sudden motion might fracture what was left of her composure. She stood by the doorway, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned the color of paper, her eyes wide and glassy, reflecting the faint light in twin shards that shimmered with exhaustion. There was something ancient in her expression, the look of someone who had fought too long against something far larger than herself, someone who had carried a secret heavy enough to warp her posture and hollow her breath. Her lips moved, forming fragments of phrases that never quite made it out. "Everything is fine. She's with friends, I told you." The same fragile refrain she had used before. But here, surrounded by the sterile aftermath of whatever she had done, the words lost their shape entirely. They became meaningless, a collection of sounds that could no longer mask the tremor in her voice or the truth bleeding through her silence. I could feel her desperation, the way she tried to fill the air between us with explanations she no longer believed, and I realized with an ache that her lies weren't crafted to deceive me. They were built to protect her from what she had already done. I stepped closer, closing the distance inch by inch, and with each step the smell of bleach grew stronger until it coated my tongue, until I could almost taste the memory of whatever she had tried to erase. On the dresser, a drawer hung slightly open, and inside, the faint glint of something metallic caught my eye. A ring, small and delicate, one I remembered too well, one that didn't belong to my sister. It lay there like a confession, quiet and damning, and when I looked back at her, she knew that I knew. The silence between us thickened, and I could almost hear her heartbeat stuttering, trying to keep pace with mine. Her face crumpled, just slightly, the corners of her mouth trembling as she fought to hold on to the illusion, but it was slipping fast, slipping like sand through trembling fingers, and in that moment, I saw her not as my sister, the liar or the protector, but as a terrified human being who had reached her breaking point. The air in the room seemed to change texture then, dense and heavy like water, slowing everything down until every heartbeat felt like an eternity. My mind raced through fragments of memory. The last time I'd seen our mother standing in this doorway, laughing about something trivial, the way my sister had flinched when she mentioned the argument they'd had days ago, the quiet phone calls in the middle of the night that always ended too quickly, each recollection stacked upon the next, forming a narrative I didn't want to believe, yet one that fit too perfectly to ignore. My eyes drifted again toward the rug, toward that faint, irregular shadow that refused to blend with the polished floorboards, and I understood that whatever my sister had tried to clean, whatever she had scrubbed and scrubbed until her hands bled, could never be fully erased. The truth leaves residue. It seeps deep into the grain, into the air, into the very walls. I moved closer, drawn by something primal, something beyond choice, as though the truth itself were pulling me forward. I reached the edge of the rug and paused, feeling her eyes on me, her breath catching, her body tensing in silent protest. I didn't want to hurt her, didn't want to push her further into that abyss she was already sinking into, but I also couldn't stop myself. My hand trembled as I reached down, my fingertips brushing the coarse fabric, and the moment I began to lift it, the room seemed to exhale. Beneath it, the wooden floor was darker, stained in a pattern that spoke of struggle, of something wiped away too quickly, and though I couldn't see everything, I saw enough. I froze there, half bent, staring at the ghost of what my sister had tried to erase, and a cold calm settled over me, the kind that comes not from peace, but from shock, so deep it numbs the body. I let the rug fall back into place, the fabric whispering against the floor like a secret returning to silence, and when I looked up, my sister was already crying, silently, helplessly, as though the act of holding it in had finally become unbearable. Her body shook, her shoulders caving inward, and for the first time since I'd arrived, she looked small, so small, like a child who had tried to fix something and only made it worse. I wanted to reach for her, to tell her that we could find a way through this, that the truth didn't have to destroy everything, but the words refused to form. They would have been too simple for something so heavy, too fragile to hold the weight of what had happened here. I sat beside her instead, the edge of the bed dipping under our shared weight, and for a long while, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall and the muffled pulse of the wind outside, brushing against the windows like fingertips. The smell of bleach was still there, sharp and unforgiving, but beneath it I could sense something else now, the faint, undeniable scent of what it had tried to cover, the memory of iron and sorrow that no chemical could erase. My sister's breath hitched with every attempt to inhale, and I realized she hadn't truly breathed since the moment I stepped inside the house. Her eyes stared straight ahead, unseeing, fixed on the photograph she had turned face down, and in her stillness I recognized the paralyzing weight of guilt, the kind that corrodes slowly from within. I wanted to understand, to ask how, why, when, but those questions would come later. Right now, what mattered was the simple truth that she wasn't a monster. She was a human being cornered by fear, by grief, by the unbearable instinct to protect. Perhaps she hadn't meant for things to go this far. Perhaps it had been an accident. Perhaps it was self-defense. Or perhaps the details didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that she had faced something unspeakable alone, and it had broken her. I placed my hand over hers, cold and trembling, and felt the faint pulse beneath her skin, fragile, uneven, alive. She turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting mine, and in that gaze I saw the whole story unfold without a single word. The argument, the panic, the aftermath, the desperate scrubbing, the endless nights spent trying to rewrite reality. I saw the love too, twisted and desperate but still love, the kind that would rather destroy itself than let the truth escape. I squeezed her hand and whispered in the quiet of my thoughts that we would face it together, whatever it was, that I wouldn't abandon her to the darkness she had created. She blinked, and a tear slipped down her cheek, cutting a clean line through the grime of sleepless nights. The moment stretched, fragile and sacred, as if the house itself had paused to listen. Then she nodded, just once, the smallest motion, but it was enough. It was surrender and relief all at once, the first crack in the wall she had built around herself. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain from my shoulders, and though fear still coiled in the pit of my stomach, something else began to rise. Not forgiveness yet, but the faint, trembling seed of understanding. Outside, the wind shifted, the first raindrops tapping softly against the window pane, and the sound was almost comforting, like the earth itself offering absolution. I looked at my sister, broken and trembling beside me, and I knew that the story wasn't over yet. The truth had surfaced, but redemption would take time, love, and a courage we hadn't yet found. Before I continue, if you've been following this story and feeling that tightness in your chest, that quiet ache that comes when you sense the truth hovering just out of reach, take a breath with me now, and remember to subscribe, because the moment we cross this threshold, everything changes. The truth that has been whispering through every frame of this story is about to speak aloud, and it will not be gentle. The night arrived too quickly, settling over the house like a veil drawn by invisible hands, thick and impenetrable, muffling the world beyond the walls. I could feel the hours collapsing inward, time folding itself around the moment we both sat in the stillness of that room, unable to move forward, unable to go back. The storm outside deepened, rain drumming against the roof in relentless rhythm, and each drop sounded like a countdown to something inevitable. My sister had not spoken since her quiet nod, and her silence was no longer defensive. It was heavy with surrender, an unspoken acknowledgement that the truth no longer belonged to her alone. I could feel it there, breathing between us, alive and restless, waiting to be named. I stood slowly, my legs trembling with the weight of too much stillness, and crossed to the window. The world outside was blurred and formless, the rain streaking down the glass in silvery veins, but the reflection that stared back at me was sharp and unflinching, my face pale, my eyes hollowed by understanding, and behind me, her reflection, small and bowed, like a figure in mourning. It struck me then that we were not just sisters trapped in a terrible night. We were two pieces of the same broken mirror, each reflecting the other's guilt and love, each bearing the cracks the other could not fix. I turned from the window and walked to the nightstand, my hand hovering above the face-down photograph. The room seemed to inhale with me, a long, trembling breath, and as I flipped the frame upright, the truth looked back in color and shadow. Our mother's smile, frozen mid-laughter, her eyes bright with life that was now gone. The photograph trembled in my hand, the glass smudged by my fingerprints, and for a moment I could not tell if the shaking came from the storm or from inside me. My sister's quiet sob broke through the air, and I turned to see her crumpled on the edge of the bed, her hands pressed against her face as though she could hold herself together by sheer force. I sat beside her again, the photograph between us, a bridge of memory and loss. And finally she began to speak, not with clear sentences, not with explanations, but with the fragmented, trembling rhythm of confession that spills from a heart too full to contain itself. Her words came like wind through broken glass, stuttering, cutting, dissolving. She said it wasn't supposed to happen, said she only wanted to make it stop, said that one moment had changed everything. The argument had begun in the kitchen, she said, the same place that now gleamed with unnatural cleanliness. Words had turned sharp, too sharp, slicing through years of buried resentment until the air itself vibrated with fury. Our mother had said something cruel, something final, and my sister, already frayed by exhaustion and fear, had snapped. A push, a fall, a sound that split the air, followed by a silence so complete it seemed to erase the world. I could see it all in my mind's eye as she spoke. The shock, the denial, the desperate attempts to wake her, the trembling hands that reached for the bleach not to hide guilt, but to undo what couldn't be undone. The scrubbing had been frantic, endless, a ritual of regret, an attempt to cleanse herself as much as the room. She hadn't known what to do. She had called no one, told no one, waited through the night for a miracle that never came. And when morning broke, she'd folded her mother's hands, whispered something I would never know, and made the decision that had set this entire night in motion, to lie, to protect, to bury the truth beneath the scent of bleach and the brittle mask of a smile. Her voice broke completely then, dissolving into sobs that shook the bed frame, and I felt something inside me crack open, not from anger, but from the unbearable weight of empathy. I saw her as she was, not a villain, not even a coward, but a human being crushed beneath the enormity of what one moment of pain had done. I reached for her hand and she let me hold it this time, her fingers cold but clinging, and together we sat in that small, suffocating room, two survivors of the same tragedy, bound not by blood, but by the silence that had nearly destroyed us. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The storm outside eased, its rage spent, and in the quiet that followed, I heard something else, the faint hum of dawn preparing to rise. When the first thin light of morning crept through the cracks in the curtains, it felt like forgiveness, hesitant but real. My sister had fallen asleep sitting upright, her hand still in mine, her face streaked with the remnants of tears and time. I watched her in that fragile half-light and saw the faintest trace of peace on her features, a peace that came not from absolution, but from the simple release of truth. I stood, careful not to wake her, and walked toward the kitchen, my footsteps soft against the cold floor. The house no longer felt like an accomplice to a lie. It felt emptied, hollow, ready to be filled again with something true. The bleach smell lingered still, but fainter now, diluted by rain and dawn, replaced by the raw scent of a house remembering how to breathe. I filled a glass with water and drank slowly, letting the cold slide down my throat, grounding me in the moment. The past could not be undone, but it could be faced. When I returned to her room, she stirred, her eyes blinking open, disoriented at first, then sharpening into recognition. For the first time in months, maybe years, I smiled at her, a small, fragile smile, and after a moment, she returned it. The kind of smile that doesn't erase the pain, but acknowledges it. We sat together in silence, the morning light growing stronger, and it felt like the house was exhaling, shedding the tension it had held for so long. We would call the police soon. We would tell the truth. There would be consequences. There would be grief. There would be questions we could not answer. But there would also be freedom. There would be a chance to rebuild, to mourn honestly, to let love be something pure again instead of poisoned by secrecy. As the first sunbeam broke through the curtains, striking the photograph of our mother on the nightstand, I felt her presence, not as a ghost, not as a haunting, but as a warmth, a forgiveness so vast it filled the air. I whispered a thank you into the quiet, unsure if it was to her, to the universe, or to the fragile, flawed woman beside me who had finally found the courage to let go. And to you, watching, reading, feeling this, remember this moment. Because the truth, no matter how devastating, will always set something free. Maybe not in the way you expect, maybe not in the way you wish, but always in the way you need. My sister and I walked out of that house later that morning, the air fresh and unburdened, the storm clouds thinning above us. The police cars would come, the questions would follow, but somehow I knew that we would survive it. That love, complicated, scarred, imperfect love, would carry us through. Because redemption is not about erasing what was done. It's about choosing to live despite it. As we stood there on the porch, side by side, I reached for her hand once more, and this time, when she squeezed back, her grip was steady. The scent of bleach was fading from the air, replaced by the faint sweetness of wet earth and the promise of sunlight. It was over, and it was beginning. If this story reached you, if it made you feel something, even the smallest tremor of recognition, then hold on to that. Because in every ending lies a quiet rebirth, and in every truth, however painful, there's a seed of healing waiting to bloom. Subscribe if you haven't yet, not just to this story but to the idea that light can find its way through even the darkest rooms. The storm has passed, the house is still, and we are finally free. Morning came not like a sudden burst of light, but like the slow exhale of a weary world learning how to breathe again. The house that once pulsed with tension now sat in fragile stillness, and the first rays of sun spilled across its walls as if blessing every scar it had been forced to bear. Dust particles danced in the beams of gold that cut through the air, moving lazily, almost reverently, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I allowed myself to simply watch. The house had survived, and so had we. The walls that had once trapped silence now held the faint hum of possibility, and even the air smelled different. Not of bleach, not of fear, but of damp earth and renewal drifting through the open windows. My sister was asleep on the couch, wrapped in a blanket that had belonged to our mother, her face softened by a kind of peace that had been unimaginable only days before. There was exhaustion in her features, yes, but beneath it something new shimmered, the fragile trace of release. I stood in the doorway for a long while, just listening to her steady breathing, the soft rhythm anchoring me to the present moment. It was strange, almost holy, to realize that we were still here, that the truth had not consumed us, but carved a space for something honest to grow in its wake. The police had done their work, the questions had been asked, and though there were consequences neither of us could escape, the burden of secrecy was gone. The weight had shifted, transformed from something crushing into something we could finally carry together. The days that followed blurred in a rhythm of quiet labor and slow mending. There were visits to the station, papers to sign, tears to shed in sterile rooms where time felt thick and merciless. But through it all, there was an undercurrent of strange serenity. My sister never denied what happened. She told them everything, her voice trembling but clear. And when she finished, there was a silence in the room that no one dared to fill. The truth had its own gravity, its own sacred space, and for the first time in her life, she stood inside it without flinching. The authorities saw what I saw, a tragedy, yes, but also a human being who had reached her breaking point and found the courage to speak afterward. There was no trial in the end, no prison cell waiting for her, only a place designed for healing, where professionals would help her untangle the grief and guilt that had woven themselves into her bones. I visited her there as often as I could. The first time, she couldn't meet my eyes. The second, she smiled weakly. By the third, she was sitting in sunlight, her hands still but no longer trembling. We spoke little, because words were unnecessary. The silence between us had changed. No longer the heavy quiet of secrets, but a gentle space of understanding. Each visit became easier, softer, threaded with small gestures of normalcy. A cup of tea, a shared memory, a short walk in the garden where she tended the small patch of soil as if planting forgiveness itself. The flowers she grew, pale daisies and lavender, filled the air with scents that replaced the acrid ghost of bleach in my memory, until even that smell no longer brought pain, but remembrance. Back at the house, I devoted myself to restoration, not as punishment, but as an act of devotion. Every creak of the floorboards, every crack in the wall, became a companion to my solitude. I opened the curtains each morning to let the light in, letting it bathe the empty rooms until the walls glowed with warmth. The kitchen, once a site of tension, became my sanctuary. I scrubbed it not to erase, but to reclaim. I learned to cook again, to fill the air with the aroma of bread instead of chemicals, to let laughter replace the sterile silence that had once clung to every surface. Sometimes I would catch my reflection in the polished surfaces and be startled by how much older I looked, but there was a calmness there too, a quiet strength that comes from surviving what should have broken you. At night, I would sit by the window with a cup of tea, listening to the distant sounds of life, a dog barking, the hum of traffic, the occasional echo of laughter, and I would feel something close to gratitude, not for what had happened, never for that, but for the strange grace of endurance, the resilience that had kept us from disappearing into the darkness completely. My sister wrote to me often from the center, her letters filled with small moments of progress, a book she'd finished, a class she was taking, a new friend she'd made. Her words carried a tone I hadn't heard from her since childhood, sincerity without fear, hope without denial. Each letter felt like a bridge being rebuilt plank by plank, until one day when I opened an envelope and saw her handwriting steadier than ever, I knew she was ready to come home. Her return wasn't marked by ceremony or fanfare. It was quiet, understated, like the gentle opening of a long-shut door. I met her at the gate, and for a moment we simply stood there, unsure of how to begin again. Then she smiled, small, hesitant, but real, and the distance that had stretched between us evaporated like mist under sunlight. We embraced, and the world seemed to exhale with us. That night we walked through every room of the house together, pausing in doorways, touching walls, breathing in the life that had returned to the space. When we reached her old room, the room that had once been the epicenter of everything, she hesitated. I thought she might turn away, but instead, she stepped inside, slowly, deliberately, as though reclaiming it with each breath. The bed was new, the walls painted a soft cream, the rug replaced by one she had chosen herself. The photograph of our mother, once face down in shame, now stood upright on the nightstand, its glass cleaned, its edges framed by sunlight. My sister crossed to it, tracing our mother's smiling face with her fingertips, and I saw her lips move, not in prayer or apology, but in acknowledgement. In that silent gesture, the circle closed. The past didn't disappear, it softened. The air seemed lighter somehow, as if the room had been waiting all along for this moment of quiet reconciliation. In the months that followed, we built new routines, simple things that grounded us in the ordinary. Breakfasts shared at the table, tending the garden, long walks through the neighborhood where people had begun to greet us again without pity in their eyes. Healing, I learned, was not dramatic. It was slow, stubborn, often invisible. It lived in the small decisions, to open a window, to answer a call, to laugh when the world offered a reason. My sister began painting, her hands rediscovering a grace I hadn't seen since we were young. She filled canvases with landscapes, skies, and rivers, always water, always motion, as if trying to paint the feeling of release. Sometimes she would show me her work, shyly at first, then with growing confidence, and I would watch the way light caught her features as she spoke about colors, about layers, about how every mistake could be painted over but never fully erased. I realized then that her art was her confession, her prayer, her way of staying alive, and maybe that was what forgiveness truly was, not pretending it hadn't happened, but transforming it into something that could breathe. The anniversary of our mother's death came with the soft scent of spring rain. We decided to hold a small ceremony, just the two of us, in the garden where the earth had grown rich and green again. We planted a tree, a slender young oak, its leaves trembling with new life, and as we pressed the soil around its roots, I felt something ancient stirring within me, something like closure, but softer, rounder, more human. We stood in silence for a long while, the wind carrying whispers through the branches, and I imagined our mother's laughter drifting somewhere between them, forgiving, eternal. My sister placed a small white stone at the base of the tree, carved with a single word, love. No dates, no explanations, just that. Love, flawed, painful, enduring. It was all that remained, and it was enough. Time passed, as it always does, not healing everything but teaching us how to live alongside the ache. The house became a place of light again, filled with visitors, with conversation, with the hum of daily life. I often caught glimpses of my sister through open doorways, reading, watering plants, painting by the window, and every time, I felt a quiet awe at her resilience. There were bad days, too, moments when shadows returned and the weight of memory pressed heavy against our chests. But even then, we had each other. We no longer faced the darkness alone. Some nights we would sit together on the porch, watching the sunset blur into the horizon, and she would speak of the future with cautious hope, of travel, of teaching, of maybe starting over somewhere new. I would listen, smiling, because her voice no longer carried the tremor of fear. It carried life. Years later, when I look back on that night, the smell of bleach, the trembling lies, the unbearable silence, I no longer see it as the moment everything ended. It was, in truth, the beginning of a long, painful rebirth. Tragedy does not simply pass. It reshapes. It molds the heart into something deeper, more tender, more aware of how fragile everything truly is. My sister and I learned to live with that knowledge, to let it guide us toward compassion rather than bitterness. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I still think I hear our mother's voice in the rustle of the trees, not as reproach but as comfort, as if reminding us that even the deepest wounds can become roots for something new. And when I stand beneath the oak we planted, tall now and strong, I feel the circle of time close around us like an embrace. Life goes on, not as it was, but as it must. If you've listened this far, if this story has stirred something inside you, a memory, a loss, a glimmer of hope, take a moment to breathe and remember that redemption is never too late. Healing does not erase what was done. It teaches you how to live in its shadow without losing the light. Like this video if it touched you, share it if it reminded you that truth, no matter how painful, is a doorway to freedom, and subscribe if you believe that even in the darkest nights, there is always a sunrise waiting beyond the silence. Because this is what I have learned. No scent of bleach, no lie, no loss is powerful enough to erase love. It lingers. It transforms. It saves. And when morning finally comes, it comes for all of us.